Hello, and welcome to the final installment in our native landscaping webinar series. My name is Sarah Beyer. I'm a native landscape consultant with Oak and IO. This series has been a cooperative project between Mid-America Regional Council and Deep Roots KC with generous underwriting support from the Health Forward Foundation. Today, we're going to talk about managing your native landscape, your native garden. We're going to talk about what to do and when, and how to get the most enjoyment and the most benefit out of your garden year round. So let's dig right in. Okay, just a quick overview of our topics before we get started. We're going to divide our time again into 3 sections. We'll briefly cover when and how to plant. We'll talk about being in a management mindset, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of seasonal management and what you need to do year round. So it's time to put plants in the ground. Finally, we've arrived at the fun part. So when can I plant native plants? The best time to plant native plants is in the fall and the spring. Temperatures are cooler during these times. It's a great time for root development, particularly in the spring. You have the best selection available of native plants at our native nurseries. You have our pop-up plant sales happening around town during that time. Summer is possible, but it does put the plants through a lot of stress during the hottest part of the year. So those cooler times in the fall and spring are often the best. It allows the plants to have a little bit of cooler weather, cooler evenings, especially if it does get hot during the day. They get a little bit of a break and a chance to get established before having to deal with the sometimes rough conditions of the summer or the winter. This all assumes that you're using plants though, and not seeds. If you do want to start your native plants from seeds, please take a look at the links that come along with this video. I'll have some information in there about wintertime sowing of native plants because that is the ideal time to do that. Do pay attention to the weather conditions. If the soil is too wet, you do want to wait till it dries out a bit rather than trying to work through it. Likewise, soil that is too dry can be difficult to dig through. That's definitely preferable though to working with really saturated ground. I like to time planting for just before a rainy period. It saves me some time and effort on watering in those first few days right after the plants have gone into the ground. And just definitely try not to plant before a heat wave if you can avoid it. The plants lose so much water, the root systems just aren't developed beyond the limitations of where they were in that pot. It takes some time for them to develop a larger root system to be able to reach more water. So it's just a lot of stress on the plant during that time. So how do I plant? If you've planted a garden before, the process isn't any different, but in case you've never done it, we'll just run through it really quickly. So the first thing you want to do is lay out your plants. So we want to lay out the entire garden, every single plant before we put a single plant in the ground. Just set them in their places and then kind of stand back and look around and make sure that things are where you want them. If your design includes a lot of straight lines like this one, you might want to set up some stakes with guidelines to help you lay out those plants in the straight lines as you want them. Here you see the process during the planting of the Monarch Demonstration Garden at Loose Park. Another idea, this one also from Loose Park, is designs that call for accuracy. This is another design by Alan Branhagen, which includes sedges that are to be planted at 1 foot intervals on a grid. And so in this case, we used this template with holes cut every 1 foot and a little sprinkle of flour to mark where each plant goes. And then as you can see, they've been laid out, plants on their places. But this is by far the most popular method. Just place them where they're going to go and then stand back, take a look, adjust things as needed, and then you can just start planting them once everybody is in place. You'll just dig a hole roughly the same size as the pot. You can use a garden trowel for this. I like to plant with a Japanese hori-hori knife that's shown in the upper left there. But you can also, even if you have a lot of plants to plant, get this drill bit auger type thing on a cordless drill and use that to really quickly make your holes. You probably bought your plants in pots that look like what's on the left. And in order to remove those, you just kind of squeeze the opposite sides and go around the pot and just sort of loosen it up. And then gently supporting the plant with your fingers, turn it over and let the pot release, and then you can put it in the ground. What's on the right are landscape plugs that come in a tray that's all connected together. You can remove those by sort of pushing from the bottom and then just sort of gently wiggling the plant out and putting them into place. You want to tuck them into the ground at the same height that the plant was in the pot, and kind of secure it in, pat the loose soil around, and you're good to go. Shrubs and trees have a little bit different needs in terms of how big you're going to dig the hole and how you're going to plant them. So I'll include some materials for you there, along with the links that accompany this webinar. And once you're done planting, we need to take care of them. So the first thing we're going to do is mulch. A lot of people do use mulch for the first year or two in establishing a native garden. I think that's absolutely fine, especially if you're limited on time and the alternative is letting a bunch of weeds get established that you're going to have to fight for a long time. Mulch is absolutely not a sin. You can either mulch afterwards and tuck it in around the plants. I know some people that like to mulch first and then plant through the mulch and just kind of clear the spots away. You do want to make sure if you're doing that you're not incorporating much of the wood chips or the mulch down into the holes. Having those decaying next to the roots can be detrimental to the plant. So just there's pros and cons of doing it each way. Plants do need to be watered right after planting. Give them a good long drink, and then you'll need to keep watering for a little while. So using this 3-2-1 rule, we're going to water 3 times in the first week, 2 times in the second week. And then if you planted in the fall, once per week until a hard freeze. If you've planted in the spring, you're going to do once per week until we get through that really stressful heat of the summer. And you may even do a little bit of extra in droughty times. Just kind of look at your plants and see what they're telling you they need. So talking a little bit now about getting into a management mindset. So why are we using the word management and not maintenance? And part of that is just the connotation around those words. When we think about maintenance, that's the process of preserving, of continuing in its current state. You might maintain a classic car in a way that attempts to keep everything in as close to its original condition as possible. Management, on the other hand, is the process of influencing, of supervising, or guiding a process. Think about managing a project. So the goal is to steer the direction. You're going to react to situations as they come up, adjust as needed. The end result is ideally going to be really different from the raw materials that you started with, and that's a good thing. So when we think about gardening in this way of as managers rather than maintainers, I like this idea. A landscape architect once told me that gardening is a conversation. I think this is a really useful and beautiful metaphor. It implies this like give and take between the gardener and the plants, as well as between the plants with each other and with the weather conditions and the critters and the insects and the pollinators. I think it's just a really nice way to think about it. So this looks like being alert to and responding to the needs of the plants, which might look like watering our new gardens regularly, pruning a damaged branch, removing weeds, watching out for any wilty or droopiness, and observing the habits of the plants. Either encouraging or editing as a result. We'll talk a little bit more about when to encourage and when you might choose to edit as we go along. And just being willing to accept that the design is going to change and embrace that as part of the beauty of inviting nature into the garden and of working with these plants that have preferences and have places where they're more ideally suited, and that they're going to kind of find those on their own, and we can make our best guesses as to where they will be happy. But ultimately, we're going to be listening and engaging in that conversation. Another thing that's helpful to think about is your why. You may have heard of the concept of starting with why. So we want to find our why. Why are we choosing to garden with native plants? So you may be looking at the wildlife, the ecological value. These are the functional ecosystem services that we talked about in some of our first couple webinars. The plants providing for the insects providing for the birds. And just being that base layer of our trophic pyramid. You may be primarily choosing natives for the aesthetics, for the beauty, for the color, the seasonal changes, the sense of place that you can only get from using the plants that are native to your area. You might be looking at climate change resistance. Maybe you're wanting to improve soil health, to store more carbon, combat climate change. You might be interested for the decreased inputs. Maybe you want to spend less time fertilizing and babying plants that weren't meant to grow in your yard anyway. Likely you're some combination of all of the above, but maybe there's one that resonates or sticks out to you more than the others. And that's your why. So when in doubt, come back to your why and let it inform your decisions. Okay, so jumping right in, making some of those decisions and looking ahead, we're going to go through the year and talk about what's happening in the garden during each period. We'll talk about your garden to-do lists for each season. And because my why is about providing for wildlife and attracting them to my garden, I'm going to share with you some fun critters you can be on the lookout for in each season, as well as some bird-friendly tips, because caring for songbirds that visit the garden is a big part of my desire to garden with native plants as well. So we'll talk about some things that you can do to help keep those avian visitors from harm when they visit your garden. I recommend creating a garden notebook. At the very least, keep track of what you do and when. If you're so inclined, though, you can expand this to be something of a naturalist notebook and include sketches of plants, sketches of wildlife, notes about the wildlife you see visiting the garden. When do you see the first monarch of the year? When do you see the last caterpillar of the year? Those sorts of things. These little nature notes books are great for that. They're available from the Missouri Department of Conservation, either in the MDC Nature Shop online or at nature centers. So late winter, looking at January and February here, the garden looks, we've got a lot of standing stems, seed heads, great winter interest, especially with the snow on the caps of these little rudbeckias here, or black-eyed Susans. In this season, our garden tasks are, first, we're going to take inventory of our tools, sharpen blades, repair or replace things as needed. This is also the time to prune your shrubs and trees. You do want to make sure you do your homework to protect blooms. The dogwood shown here blooms on last year's wood. So if you trim before it's bloomed in the spring, you're going to lose those flowers. Other shrubs bloom on new growth, and pruning in the late winter will be just fine. So again, I'll have some links and some more information along with the video to help you include or help you figure out which option is best for your plants. For the birds in this season, if you have bird baths or feeders, get them cleaned and sanitized, and it's important to continue to do that throughout the year. While we're outside, take a moment to evaluate the placement of feeders and take steps to avoid bird strikes on windows. And I'll have information on all of the bird tips we'll talk about. I'll include some extra information for more places to go to learn in the links that come along with the video as well. In this season, we can watch for the earliest blooms. This is vernal witch hazel up on the left there. It is the first native plant to bloom in the Kansas City area of the year. You can look for it in February and watch for these teeny tiny little flying insects, little tiny pollinators that visit the flowers. You can also see adult butterflies on warm winter days. We have just a handful of species in Kansas City that overwinter as adults. The one shown here is a mourning cloak. And of course, watch for birds feeding on the winter seeds and berries in the garden. In early spring, coming into March and April, the garden is waking up. We've got some shrubs in bloom, like the golden currant seen on the left. We've got spring ephemerals blooming. Those are plants that bloom in the spring and then die back completely to the ground, so you won't see the plant at all until next year. The bloodroot in the bottom right-hand corner is a good example of that. There's also trout lily and the bluebells at the top. You might also see pussy toes, wild sweet William, golden groundsel, and we're seeing the green tops of other perennials that will bloom later in the year coming out during this time. Garden tasks at this time of year, we're going to start weeding. So what's a weed? A weed is just a plant out of place. There's no specific definition for these are weeds and these are not. So for you, a weed might be a non-native little weedy annual plant. It might be a seedling of a native plant that you've planted but you don't want more of. On our screen here, We have common violets on the left, which I leave when they pop up. They're free ground cover, they're good bee food, and they're easy to thin out when needed. The others shown here are generally considered weeds, and most people will remove them. So going clockwise from the little blue flowers, we have chickweed, henbit, dead nettle, and of course, dandelions. So a weed is just a plant out of place, something that you don't want where it's growing. Please do, though, remove invasive species. If you have those present in your garden or on your property, look for garlic mustard, exotic honeysuckles, English ivy, also winter creeper, a link to some invasive species identification tools for you, so that when in doubt, you can check those and make sure that you do remove those, as those do cause ecological and financial harm. As I said, I leave the violets. They're a native nectar source that comes out early, good for the bees. And when in doubt, wait a little bit. So in the photo here, the image on the left is a seedling blazing star, which could be difficult to tell from some of the things that you might weed out. So if you have, stray grasses that pop up in your garden and you're pulling those, you might pull something like this on accident. So it's important to kind of learn your weeds or learn what your native seedlings look like. And when in doubt, just wait a couple of weeks and see if you get some more clues as it gets a little bit bigger. And you can always check in later and see what it looks like then. Also in the season, we're going to cut back winter stems. This slide is packed with a lot of information. All of these images are taken from a really great publication by the Xerces Society that I'll have a link to as well. So you can see that the dry standing stems of plants are a really valuable resource for these little beneficial insects. They use them to lay eggs in and protect their larvae over the winter. We're going to leave those stems standing, and then in the spring, you can cut them back. So leaving a foot or so standing for the bees to find when they emerge. A lot of folks say you should wait to do this until the temperatures are consistently 50 degrees or so. I'm not sure that we have any real good answers informed by solid science on when it's okay to cut back. Just don't be in a rush. Let it wait if it can. And if it can't, you can take what you cut back and maybe put it underneath some shrubs or something like that. So it's not necessarily removing it from the property and giving the little critters inside maybe the best chance to complete their winter cycle. So what do I do with what I cut? You can leave it in the garden. You can remove it to the compost pile, or like I said, you can spread it under some shrubs, or if you have a little sort of brush pile type area somewhere on the property. Leaving it in the garden is just fine if you have a light layer. You don't want to leave a lot of material in and around the crowns of the new plants. During this time, we can also do a gentle garden cleanup. And when I say gentle cleanup, I'm talking about maybe raking out some of the fall leaves, especially if you have prairie plants or areas where the leaves tend to gather really thick and wet. We have silver maples, and in some of the little corners and things where those can really pile up, they just compact down. And sometimes by the spring, there's just a thick, wet layer there that can smother some of our more delicate plants, especially plants that are more adapted to being in the prairie versus in a yard where they have maple leaves falling on them. So again, what you remove can go into the compost pile. You can spread it under shrubs, toss it in a brush pile type area. What you don't want to do is bag it up and send it away. Keep those nutrients and any critters that are taking shelter in the leaves on your property. Help nourish it, help keep that vibrant life there for the next year. For the birds in the season, we're going to turn off our outdoor lights during the spring migration. We have millions of birds migrating through the Kansas City area during the spring and again during the fall. Most of our songbirds migrate at night, which you may not realize, and nighttime lights are disorienting, and they can really cause some serious harm and interfere with the bird's ability to navigate. The image on the left here is from Tracy Aviary and shows some ways that you can help at the bottom. I like this diagram that just shows that that harsh bluish and white lights are the worst in terms of harming birds at night. If you can shift to warmer toned lights, shield the lights so that they are directing the light downward only and not out into the sky, and put them on motion sensors if you can. The absolute best is if you can during the spring months and fall months to turn those lights off. For us locally here in Kansas City, I recommend following Lights Out Heartland, as well as your local Audubon Society. Sometimes there will even be an alert during certain nights on the spring and fall migrations to let you know we have thousands of birds moving through the area in the next couple of nights that they're tracking, and can let you know which nights are particularly critical to leave those outdoor lights off. During this season, we are watching for birds establishing territory, maybe gathering some nesting materials in the garden. We have lots of migratory birds coming through, like the warbler in the center top photo, or the hermit thrush in the bottom left, that you may get lucky enough to see as they make their way through. We also have our queen bumblebees. They overwinter as adult bees. Just the new queens will do that. And they spend that winter underneath this insulative cover of our fallen leaves. So they are coming out in the spring and looking to restart their colonies. Another reason not to rush that cleanup, and to be gentle about it when you do need to remove those leaves. Also, our hummingbirds return, showing up around mid-April in the Kansas City area. So these are all things that you can hope to observe while you're out tending your garden. And that brings us into late spring and early summer. The garden is looking fresh, bright green. Spring shrubs and trees are blooming. We have 9-barks blooming. There's hydrangea here in the bottom left. Early summer wildflowers, our milkweeds are starting to bloom. Purple poppy mallow. We've got this yellow Missouri primrose and the blue wild indigo. Coneflowers are starting to bloom that will keep blooming throughout the next couple of months. During this time, our garden tasks, we're going to share the wealth. So we're going to learn to recognize the seedlings of the perennials in our garden, and remove those seedlings that you don't want. Either transplant them to another location of the garden or another bed, or give them away to friends. Remember that we are managers, not maintainers. So consider your goals before moving or removing plants. So some plants are not individually long-lived in the garden. Each individual plant doesn't live for many, many years, but they do reseed. So in my opinion, these are nearly always allowed to reseed and to spread. So Rose verbena, the individual plants don't live very long, but it reseeds when it's in a happy spot. It will continue to stay there because it's kind of constantly seeding those new little babies. Blazing stars are the same way. The squirrels also tend to steal them. So I always let my blazing stars reseed whenever I have babies. They're welcome to stay. And I mean, how could you turn down a plant that looks like that? And then the rudbeckias, or the black-eyed Susans, also are not individually very long-lived as a perennial plant. They live for a few years. So I do also let them reseed, because I do still want that aspect to continue in the garden and brighten my days. Some plants, however, are prolific reseeders and should nearly always be edited out, particularly in the early years of a garden. If you are just getting things established and you don't want these guys to take up too much room, then we're going to edit out those seedlings more often as we get going. So asters are the common milkweed that's shown here. Our goldenrods, golden Alexander, and obedient plant are just a few examples of some of those aggressive reseeders. So this is just a reason to do your homework on each plant that you select for your garden, so that you can kind of make some of those decisions about whether you're going to be vigilant about removing seedlings or removing seed heads or not, depending on the species. Also during this period, we can cut back those late season bloomers, things that don't bloom until the fall. We're going to remove 1/3 to 1/2 of the total height of the plant. And we can do this twice. You can do it once in May and once in June. but make your final cuts by early July. July 4th is kind of the easy to remember rule of thumb, so that they have enough time to generate the buds to form the flowers that we want to see later in the year. This creates a more compact, bushier shape, gives us more blooms. And you can make some notes about this. This is one of those things. Be sure to write down what you cut, by about how much, and what date you did it, and then reevaluate in the fall and make changes if needed for next year. For the birds, we're going to clean and change feeders frequently. If you feed hummingbirds, consider planting hummingbird-friendly flowers for fuss-free feeding. Say that 3 times fast. This is a red buckeye. It starts blooming about the time that hummingbirds show up in the spring. They really like tubular flowers, and of course, red is always a winner with hummingbirds. And you don't have to clean this, so I enjoy it, as I am not good about cleaning those hummingbird feeders. So I prefer to feed them with plants so that I know that I'm not going to accidentally cause any harm. In this season, we're going to watch for birds feeding nestlings. We may get some fledglings hopping around the yard. You can look for evidence of leafcutter bees. These little circular holes near the margins of the leaves are made by female leafcutter bees who cut off a little cap of the leaf and use it to cover the holes where they have laid their eggs, to kind of seal off each section with a little leaf cap. Also during this time, fireflies emerge. This is another great reason to go ahead and leave those outdoor lights off in the summer as well. Fireflies need to be able to see each other flashing, and it's hard for them to do that if you've got outdoor lights on. Fireflies also need those leaves to stay on the ground. They need that leaf litter and a little bit of decaying log in general, just not to keep your yard too tidy, and maybe to designate a natural area or to have a brush pile, something along those lines. So. Coming into summer, in July and August, we have ironweeds and rattlesnake master blooming. We've got compass plant, our coreopsis, sunflowers, phlox, Joe Pye weed. The pollinators are busy, busy, busy during this time. And we're going to be busy too. So we're going to continue weeding as needed. Our summer annual weeds include, starting at the left here, spurge, lamb's quarters, black medic, and mare's tail. Again, I'll have some weed ID resources for you in the links. We're going to stake or support any flopping plants. So if you've got a few that are kind of leaning over, we are going to try to get them standing up straight, or at least out of pathways, things like that. A note that good design can help prevent this if you pair tall blooms with other tall plants and grasses around them for support. Kind of remember how nature does it. Plants packed into together, they're leaning on each other. But also just in the early years, it's a little bit difficult to prevent this entirely. So it may improve over time. Blazing stars especially tend to get a little squirrely in the first couple of years. And they can sometimes get, leaning over too far, or kind of look twisty. It's kind of a neat look, actually. But anyway, you can kind of stake those up. Often it will improve as they get older and send up more stems that are a little bit sturdier. You can use sticks. You can use commercial garden stakes. You can use tomato cages. This kind of one-sided support, called like a half round plant support, can be great for something that's just kind of leaning out on one side and you just want to rein it in a little bit or get it off of a walkway, things like that. You can always clip off to stems that are too floppy. We're also going to tend to the seed heads of spring bloomers, and whether you remove or allow to remain any individual seed head may depend, again, on your goals. So go back to your why and let that help inform your decision. Also consider the age of the garden. So in the first couple of years, you may want to be more vigilant about removing aggressive reseeders to clip off those seed heads before they can fall. And then once competition is stiffer, then you may be a little bit more relaxed about it. And your decisions may be different for some plants versus others. So I love penstemons. This is Penstemon digitalis, or foxglove beard tongue on the left there. I want them to make a big visual impact, and they seem to be popular with my deer. So since I lose a few to the deer every year, I let those reseed always. If they make it long enough to produce a seed head, then I let them go. I want lots of those in my garden. On the other hand, I'm really happy with my current density of golden Alexanders, and they can get dense. For sure. It is a very enthusiastic reseeder. And so I generally just cut the flowers off after they've faded, after the pollinators have visited, but before the plant can make mature seeds. So I'm not removing a resource that the pollinators need, but I am going to go ahead and clip those off because they can overrun some of the things that they're close to in the garden. So we'll keep an eye on that. During this time, we're going to turn off outdoor lights for the fall migration, which starts in Kansas City around the middle of August and continues through the fall. During the season, we can watch for goldfinches building nests. They nest later than most songbirds, so they're busy during this time. Also look for caterpillars, and not just monarchs, which are pictured in the top there, and they're very special and we do love them, but all kinds of caterpillars. So some of the signs you can look for are eggs on leaves. You can look for holes in the leaves, or sometimes they will kind of seal up a leaf to make a little folded leaf, little leaf taco. The swallowtail there at the bottom may do that. You can look for frass, F-R-A-S-S. That is caterpillar poop, which is pictured in the bottom right there. But looking around plants, if you find some of that, like start looking underneath the leaves and see what you can find. If you check the blooms of coneflowers, you might be lucky enough to spot a camouflage looper, which is pictured in the top right there. They actually nip off little bits of the petals of the flower that they are living on and use it to adorn themselves as camouflage. So those are really fun to find, and kids especially like looking for those. Bringing us into late summer, early fall, this is yellow and purple season in the garden. We've got asters and goldenrods galore, gentians, which are down in the bottom there. Dittany is purple, our blazing stars in the top. We've got spring and summer early bloomers. The foliage is starting to fade. Fall color is present in the trees, beginning to show in the garden. Just really, really gorgeous colors during this time. So it's a great time to be out. We're going to continue weeding as needed, just anything that we happen to find. For me, honey vine is an all-season weed for me. It is native. It is a milkweed. You may have it in your garden as well. And monarchs will lay eggs on it. However, it's just extremely difficult to control once it's established, and it comes back year after year. It has a really long taproot, and it will climb over other plants and overwhelm them. So I have plenty of other less aggressive milkweeds, and since I plant for all of my native neighbors and not just for monarchs, I do pull this when I see it, and that process continues into the fall. This is a great time to plant native plants, especially shrubs and trees. They have a chance to really get that root development in before the next spring. This is a good time to divide plants as needed. Do that in September and get them nice and settled in before the really cold weather arrives so that they can be ready for the spring. We're going to clean and store our tools for the winter. We're going to leave the leaves as much as we possibly can. Here is a slide with lots of examples from the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation of different examples illustrating what lies in the leaves. So there may be chrysalises of, this is a swallowtail in the upper left. The Luna moth overwinters as a chrysalis in the leaves. Down in the bottom left, there is a now empty cocoon from a Cecropia moth. Again, we have our queen bumblebees relying on that leaf litter for insulation, and it's adding a lot of nutrients down into the soil. So as much as possible, we're going to leave the leaves. It's definitely okay to clean up walkways. It's definitely okay to remove some where you need to. We talked back in our very first episode about finding that continuum between picking up every single leaf and leaving every single leaf. And some people are going to be at one end of the spectrum. We know there are other people at the other end of the spectrum. Most of us are going to fall somewhere in between. So just think about where you fall. And again, go back to your why. We're also going to leave the stems, and we've talked about why that's important. And you've got the winter beauty, you've got the birds that will visit, you've got those stems standing, and then we can cut them back in the spring to leave those natural cavities for our stem nesting bees. For the birds in the season, if you have birdhouses or nest boxes, now is the time that you can clean them out. The birds can also do that, but this is a good time to check them and make sure everything is still in working order and that they are safe and ready to go for next year. During this season, we're going to watch for more caterpillars. We're going to watch for migrating monarchs. The monarch migration in the fall peaks in late September in Kansas City, where you'll see the largest numbers of them coming through. Make sure that your planting list includes blazing stars, includes goldenrods, includes asters, those 3 plants across the top there, for them to be able to find that nectar that they need to fuel their journey. You can also during this time find sleepy bees in the mornings before the sun hits them. If you go out into the garden, look around, you may find them curled up in flowers like this. And finally, bringing us into late fall, early winter, November, December. During this time, the garden reminds us that brown is a color too. We've got shades from tan to rust to golden yellow. Berries contrast with the snow and draw in birds. We've got the seed heads, which look really great and also continue to help feed wildlife over the winter. The last blooms of the year are going to come from Ozark witch hazel, a different witch hazel that blooms sometimes as late as December. And in the middle here, these are frost flowers, and these form on species of crownbeard or dittany when the first hard freezes force that extra moisture back out of the stems and get these really beautiful formations in the morning. During this time, we've got just a few garden tasks. We're going to continue to water new plants during drought, which happens during the winter as well. We don't notice it as much sometimes, but we need to be aware of that, especially before a cold snap, to make sure that we've got some water into the plants to help them through the winter. We want to water new trees and shrubs year round for at least 3 years. And I'll have some information on some easy ways to do that for you in the links. We're going to review our garden notebook, figure out what worked well, what we would like to do differently next year, and we're going to plan new gardens. For the birds during this time, provide unfrozen wet water during the winter months, whether that's a heated bird bath. We can watch for them coming to enjoy that. Also look for these ground feeding dark-eyed juncos in the bottom corner there. I always love seeing evidence that little birds have been through in the snow. And again, on warm winter days, you might see butterflies like this question mark butterfly flying around looking for tree sap to drink. It is a great time of year to have a nice view out the window and a warm drink and think about doing it all over again next year. All right, if you would like to learn more about any of the things that we talked about today, please check out the supplemental resources and the links that go along with them. You can find that at Mid-America Regional Council or Deep Roots websites at marc.org or deeproots.org. Again, I always recommend the Planet Native Conference as an excellent place to take the next step in learning about Native landscaping. Whether you're a beginner or a professional, you will find something there that is accessible and educational to you. If you have questions about this series, please contact Deep Roots or Mid-America Regional Council at the information on your screen. It has been an absolute pleasure to present these, and I hope that you have enjoyed them and found them useful. And again, we want to give a big thanks to the Health Forward Foundation for their support of this series. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.